She stood quietly in a boarding line, a respected judge with decades of service. 10 minutes later, she was in handcuffs. No questions, no warning, just a whisper, a bias, and a system that forgot to ask who she was. But what happened next shook the nation. This isn't just a story about one woman, it's a reckoning. Stay with us. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore.
If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It began like most quiet tragedies do, with a stillness so ordinary it nearly went unnoticed. The Denver International Airport was waking up slowly. The sun poured a soft glow through its glass walls, casting long golden stripes across the polished floor. Passengers rolled suitcases past coffee stands, boarding calls hummed through the PA system, and beneath the surface of routine, something unspoken was waiting to rise. Marcia Ellison stood in the priority boarding line, unaware that her presence alone had already disturbed the balance. 61 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a low bun, she wore a simple gray pantsuit and flats her posture as upright as the career she had carved through stone. Her leather bag held only the essentials case briefs, a boarding pass to Philadelphia, and a handwritten keynote speech she was due to deliver the next morning at a National Judicial Reform Summit. It would be her last public address before retirement. A capstone, a legacy. She had no security escort, no name tag announcing her title. Just the calm confidence of someone who belonged. But in spaces that have never been fully designed to hold women like her, black, accomplished, unapologetically poised belonging has always come at a cost. Across the lounge, Patrice Langford adjusted her pearl necklace and stared. She was in her late 50s, affluent, white, and used to being noticed. But this woman, the one who stood still without shrinking, somehow made her feel invisible. It wasn't Marcia's presence that disturbed her. It was her stillness, her unbothered elegance, her refusal to shrink. That to Patrice felt threatening. She stepped up to the gate desk, feigning concern. Her voice was soft, but her words were jagged. "That woman in the gray suit," she said, nodding discreetly. "She's been watching everyone's bags. Something feels off. I don't feel safe flying with her." The gate agent blinked, confused. "She's in the priority line. Scanned in like everyone else." But Patrice leaned in. "She's acting suspicious. You need to check." That was all it took. Not proof, not policy, just the invocation of fear dressed up as vigilance. And somewhere in the airport's operations room, 2 transportation security officers were notified of a potential threat in the priority line at Gate 32A. Officer Brent Wallace was the first to stand. He adjusted his badge and flexed his jaw, already forming an opinion before leaving the room. His partner, Daryl Quinn, followed with quieter footsteps. Brent liked clarity, authority, and swift compliance. Daryl liked order, but lacked the will to challenge what felt wrong. They didn't ask for a name. They didn't check surveillance. They just went. Meanwhile, Marcia scrolled through her tablet, eyes scanning a legal journal article she had highlighted the night before. She didn't see the woman's whisper, didn't hear the gate agent's hesitation. She had no idea that her identity had already been rewritten by someone else. She stood where she had stood for the last 15 minutes, waiting calmly for the boarding call, her ID and ticket tucked neatly in the pocket of her blazer. And then came the boots. The rhythm of the terminal shifted. Not a shout, not a siren, just the sharp, unmistakable sound of assumption in uniform. Marcia felt them before she saw them. The air changed. The attention shifted. The calm broke. She turned slowly to find two officers standing a few feet away. Brent stepped forward, hands on his belt. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step out of the line." She blinked once. Calm. "Is there an issue?" "We received a complaint," he said. "Passenger concern. You've been making people uncomfortable." By standing here, she asked, "We just need to ask you a few questions." Darrell added his voice lower, but still distant. Marcia closed her tablet, her expression unchanged. She'd seen this before this kind of performance, dressed up as protocol. "I'll cooperate," she said, stepping aside. "But I'd like to know what this is about." "You don't need to know right now," Brent muttered. "Just show us your ID." She handed it over without hesitation. "Marcia Ellison?" she said. He barely looked at the name. "What do you do for a living?" "I uphold the law," she replied. Brent smirked. "That right lawyer. I'm the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court." There it was, the first fracture. But it didn't land. Not the way it should have. Brent was already past the point of listening. Darrell's eyes shifted slightly, but he said nothing. "Do you think you're above procedure?" Brent asked, voice hardening. "No," she said. "I just know the law. And I know the limits of your authority." People nearby were watching now, not speaking, just recording. Marcia felt the phones on her like heat, but still she didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She asked steady as ever. "May, I have your badge numbers for my records." Brent's face darkened. "You don't get to make demands." "It's not a demand," she said. "It's a legal right." That was the moment. The moment where the story could have stopped. But power rarely turns back once it's been set in motion. Brent reached forward and grabbed her wrist. Not gently, not procedurally, just forcefully enough to send a message. Gasps echoed through the boarding area. A phone dropped. A child asked, "Why are they arresting her?" The cuffs were cold, tight, unnecessary. As Marcia stood still, arms pulled behind her voice, measured, she said one thing only. "You didn't even ask who I was." And they hadn't. Because they didn't need to know. They had already decided. And in that moment, beneath the soft hum of the terminal, among the scent of coffee and engine fuel, an ordinary morning turned into a national reckoning. It began with a whisper. But what followed would echo far beyond Gate 32A. There's something about the way time moves differently when your dignity is on the line. Seconds stretch, details sharpen, and silence grows heavy with judgment. Marcia Ellison knew this feeling. She had seen it in courtrooms, the pause before a verdict, the hush when a witness hesitates. But never had she expected to feel it wrapped around her wrists, in the middle of an airport, under the unblinking eyes of strangers, and the cold indifference of two men in uniform. They marched her through the terminal like she had something to prove. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. But she held her head upright, every step deliberate. The cuffs chafed at her skin, not from pressure, but from principle. Her arms were pinned behind her, but her posture never broke. This wasn't shame. This was evidence. Behind her, Officer Brent Wallace walked with the confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His authority was worn like armor. Officer Darrell Quinn followed with eyes cast downward as if watching the ground would shield him from guilt. It didn't. Passengers stared. A woman whispered to her child. A man filmed silently, his phone raised with trembling fingers. There were no cries of outrage, just the soft, stunned murmur of realization. They were watching something wrong unfold in real time, and they weren't stopping it. That, too, was part of the story. When they reached the airport security office, a sterile room tucked behind a nondescript door near Gate 32A, Marcia was asked to sit. She did slowly, with the grace of someone who had sat through depositions and hearings far more hostile than this. But still, her hands remained behind her back, encased in steel. Brent stood across from her, arms folded. "You're being held for questioning. Don't make it harder than it has to be." She met his eyes. "Define harder." Brent's jaw flexed. "You think you're clever. I think I'm being detained without cause," she said. "And that will be reflected in my statement." Daryl shifted beside him, visibly uncomfortable. "We just need to verify your ID, ma'am." "You already have it," she said calmly. "And yet, I'm still in cuffs." Brent leaned forward. "We get complaints every day. We don't have time to verify every detail." "That's the problem," she replied. "You act first. You verify later, if at all." He turned away, agitated. But she didn't stop. "You didn't ask who I was," she said. "You saw a black woman in a business suit standing where you didn't expect her to be. And that was enough." Outside the room, a clerk had begun to review security footage. It took less than 5 minutes to confirm what Marcia had claimed. All along, she hadn't moved from her place in line. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She hadn't touched a single bag. Inside, no one said a word as the footage played back silently on the monitor. Marcia standing still, reading, waiting. That was it. No disruption. No incident. No justification. The tension in the room cracked. Daryl spoke first. "Chief Justice Ellison, we weren't aware." "You weren't curious," she interrupted. And that was the truth that stung more than anything else. They hadn't just failed to ask. They hadn't cared to. It wasn't long before the story began to leak beyond the walls of that office. A gate agent who had witnessed the arrest sent a message to her manager. Someone from the crowd uploaded the video to social media with a caption that read, "They just cuffed a black woman in first class. No explanation." By the time the cuffs came off, the damage had already been done. Not just to Marcia, but to the lie of equal protection. The footage was spreading. And so was the truth. Brent remained silent as Daryl unlocked the restraints. She flexed her fingers once, then twice, before slowly rolling down her sleeves. "I'd like to speak with Airport Legal," she said, "and I'll be filing a formal complaint through the Judicial Oversight Committee." "You're overreacting," Brent muttered. Marcia didn't flinch. "You're underprepared." She collected her things, her briefcase, her ID, her dignity, and walked out not as a victim, but as a witness. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to rage. The facts would speak louder than outrage ever could. And for someone who had built her life on facts, that was more than enough. Back in the terminal, passengers still lingered. Some nodded. Some looked away in shame. But one young man, early 20s, approached her quietly. "I recorded everything he said. I didn't know what to do. But I thought maybe you'd need it." She nodded. "Send it. But not for me. For the record." As she boarded the flight, Later than scheduled without apology, she felt the weight of what had just occurred settle into her bones. Not just the humiliation, but the responsibility. Because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. Somewhere, there was a young black girl who'd one day stand in a priority line wearing a suit that said she belonged. And when someone whispered that she didn't, the system needed to know that it had once whispered the same thing to a Chief Justice, and that the Chief Justice spoke back with calm, with clarity, and with a name they would never forget again. Someone had been at the terminal. Someone had filmed the moment the cuffs clicked shut. And when that clip hit the internet, the truth started to ripple. Not just a passenger, not just a complaint. This was Marcia Ellison, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, handcuffed without cause, silenced without question, judged without inquiry. And this time, the court of public opinion moved faster than the official response ever could. Within hours, the footage had been viewed over 700,000 times. By dawn, it was playing on the morning news. No sirens, no chaos. Just a calm black woman standing still, surrounded by the uneasy buzz of a terminal and the brutal clarity of assumption in action. The hashtags came first, then the interviews, then the silence, the kind that hangs in the offices of institutions suddenly aware they've been seen. Marcia said nothing publicly. Not yet. She watched it all unfold from her home in Chapel Hill. The television muted her tea untouched. Her legal pad open half filled with notes, not for court, but for clarity of what had happened, what had been violated, and what must come next. At first, the calls came from journalists, then from civil rights attorneys, then from people she hadn't spoken to in years, colleagues, mentees, law students from states away. One message hit differently. It came from a name she didn't immediately recognize: Ana Diaz, 37, a public defender from Phoenix. "I've been you," the message read. Not cuffed, but overlooked, erased. I watched the video with my daughter. I told her your name. I needed her to know you. That was the moment Marcia decided she would speak, not for vindication, not for revenge, but for remembrance, because the real harm wasn't that they didn't know who she was. It was that they didn't care to ask. The following week, Marcia arrived back in Denver, not as a passenger, but as a plaintiff. Not escorted, not hidden. She walked through the same terminal doors, past the same security lines, past the same gate where the quiet fracture in the system had first split open. People watched her now, but not with suspicion, with recognition, with apology. In the media room adjacent to the terminal's main atrium, she stood behind a podium. No lights, no prepared speech, just her voice, her truth, and the full gravity of a moment that had outgrown even her own name. I was detained. She began not because of what I did, but because of how I appeared. Because someone whispered, and the system chose to listen to the whisper over the facts. The room stayed silent. A stillness born not of awe, but of shame. I don't speak today as a judge. I speak as a citizen, as a mother, as a woman who has spent her life studying the law, only to be reminded that no amount of knowledge, achievement, or title can always shield you from the simple truth of how some people see you. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. But it carried. I was handcuffed for standing still. That is not just a procedural failure. That is a cultural one. And I'm not here to ask for an apology. I'm here to ensure accountability. That word, accountability, rang like a bell, through every channel that broadcasted her speech live. It was no longer just a story. It was a question posed to a nation. What happens when the protectors of law forget to recognize those who wrote it? She announced the formation of a national initiative, the Flight Rights Project, a partnership with civil rights organizations and legal scholars to track and challenge cases of discriminatory profiling in transit systems nationwide. Not just lawsuits, not just outrage, action. The Department of Transportation called her within the day. By the end of the week, Internal Affairs had launched a formal investigation into the conduct of officers Brent Wallace and Darrell Quinn. Officer Quinn agreed to cooperate. He admitted he'd had doubts, that he hadn't known who she was, but he knew it felt wrong. And he had said nothing. Marcia didn't seek his punishment. She requested his participation in reform. Let him be part of the change, she told the board. He stayed silent once. Let him not do it again. As for Officer Wallace, he refused to comment. But the record now spoke louder than he could. The gate agent who took the complaint from Patrice Langford also came forward. She said she'd hesitated, that something had felt off in the way the woman spoke, in the tone that turned concern into condemnation. But she hadn't pushed back. She had complied. Her statement became a case study in every new training module Marcia's team developed when comfort is confused for threat and when silence becomes consent. Still, Marcia never mentioned Patrice's name publicly. She didn't need to. The lesson wasn't about punishing one whisper. It was about dismantling the system that allowed whispers to hold more weight than truth. Weeks passed. The world kept spinning. But something had shifted. In law schools, students studied the case as a living example of systemic bias. In airports, TSA agents began retraining sessions with footage from Gate 32A. In neighborhoods, conversations once whispered became spoken out loud about dignity, about appearance, about the weight of names asked or not. And through it all, Marcia remained steady. She returned to court. She ruled on cases. She mentored young lawyers, but her calendar also filled with something new: town halls, community forums, closed-door meetings with policymakers. Because the name they forgot had now become the name behind a movement. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, justice felt like it wasn't just reacting, it was remembering. There are places that remember, not because they have a memory, but because something happened there that shifted the air. Gate C-17 at Denver International Airport had become such a place. At first glance, nothing about it had changed. The same vinyl seats, the same polished floor, the same automatic doors opening and closing with the rhythm of departures. But the people who passed through it now moved differently. They looked longer. They noticed more. It had become more than a gate. It was now a threshold where silence had cracked and accountability had begun to speak. 2 weeks after her public statement, Marcia Ellison returned to that exact location, not in chains, not with cameras, but with intention. It was the first public event held under the banner of the Flight Rights Project, the legal initiative she had founded in response to her wrongful detainment. But she refused to call it a rally. This wasn't protest. This was testimony by the people for the people on the ground, where dignity had once been denied. A small crowd gathered seated on folding chairs, arranged in a half circle beneath the fluorescent lights of the waiting area. Beside the boarding gate stood a portable podium, draped with a navy blue cloth and a simple white sign, "Know Your Rights." demand their respect. There were no chants, no angry signs, just a room full of people who understood something bigger had been triggered, something unfinished. Marcia stepped forward, not wearing a robe, not guarded by security. Just her, a soft charcoal coat over her shoulders, a single notebook in hand. She began not with her story, but with someone else's. She spoke of a grandmother in Sacramento who had been forced to remove her head wrap in front of TSA agents, of a college student in Atlanta profiled while carrying a physics textbook and a backpack, of a war veteran in Chicago detained for 15 minutes because his service dog barked at a loudspeaker. These weren't headlines. These were people, and Marcia made it clear that what had happened to her at Gate C-17 was not a fluke, it was a pattern. And patterns could be broken, but only if seen first. Behind her, seated quietly in the second row, was Darrell Quinn, no longer in uniform, just a man now called back, not by summons, but by conscience. He had written to her after the internal investigation had cleared. A full page, no excuses, just a sentence that stuck. I didn't stop it, and I won't forget that. Marcia hadn't responded, not directly. Instead, she had invited him to this forum, not to shame him, but to let him witness. And when a community member stood and asked, "What happens to officers like the ones who cuffed you?" Marcia didn't look away. She said, "Some are held accountable by the law, others by the mirror, and both matter." That answer silenced the room in the way only truth can. It didn't spark applause. It sparked reflection. Later, a young woman, early 20s, first-generation college student, stood to speak. Her voice trembled. "I've been pulled aside every time I fly. I didn't think it would ever matter to anyone. I didn't think I mattered." Marcia's reply came not as a soundbite, but as an offering. "You mattered even when no one acted like you did. The work now is making sure no one forgets it again." A mural had been unveiled at the edge of the gate just before the event. Painted by a local Denver artist, it showed an open boarding gate, but instead of an airplane outside, it revealed a path winding into a horizon made of scales, justice scales that shimmered like wings. Below it, a bronze plaque bore the words, "Gate C-17 for every journey. Delayed by injustice, may justice be cleared for takeoff." That was Marcia's idea, not for her name to be there, but for the message to outlast the moment. Reporters tried to press her for quotes after the event. "Will you sue the TSA? What should happen to the woman who filed the false complaint? Are you considering a political career?" She smiled softly. "Justice isn't a campaign. It's a commitment. I'm not here to win. I'm here to change how we lose." The answers didn't trend, but they planted something deeper. Within a month, the Flight Rights Project launched its first public database for travelers to report racial profiling incidents. By the third month, it had partnered with 5 civil rights legal firms to provide free consultation for passengers facing discrimination. By the end of the year, 2 major airlines implemented revised bias training inspired by the modules Marcia helped write. None of these things made national headlines. But in legal classrooms, young black law students wrote essays about Gate C-17. In staff rooms at regional airports, supervisors replayed her testimony as part of mandatory training. And in one small church in Raleigh, a pastor quoted her in a Sunday sermon, not because she was famous, but because she had remained human through something designed to dehumanize. Justice didn't come wrapped in a verdict or a press release. It came slowly, daily, one policy at a time, one witness at a time, one moment of courage placed directly where silence had once lived. And for Gate C-17, that was enough. The plaque still shines. Travelers still pause. Not everyone knows what happened there. But those who do, they never look away again. The strange thing about a name is how quickly it can become both shield and target. For weeks after the incident, the name Marcia Ellison traveled faster than the woman herself ever could. It filled headlines, court filings, rally chants, law school lecture slides. But for Marcia, the name had never been the point. It was what stood behind it that mattered: the lifetime of work, the scars unspoken, the unbending belief that dignity is not given, but defended. She never wanted to be a symbol. Symbols are too easily flattened, misread, celebrated for the wrong reasons. What Marcia wanted was to remind people that even justice wears street clothes, that even the most qualified among us can be reduced with a glance if we allow the system to keep choosing fear over fairness. She returned to Chapel Hill quietly, her calendar full, but her spirit settled. The speaking invitations kept arriving: universities, national panels, state bar associations. But she chose her moments carefully. When she did speak, it was never about herself. It was about the student who emailed her in tears after being searched on her way to a scholarship interview. It was about the airport janitor who left her a note saying, "You walked out so others could walk in with their heads up." In her final year on the bench, Marcia used her chambers not only to shape the law, but to reshape who felt welcome within it. She invited law clerks from historically black colleges. She created internships for students whose resumes weren't filled with Ivy League shine, but with stories of grit and grace. She mentored in the evenings, not from obligation, but because she knew silence, too, can be a luxury. When asked if she had forgiven those involved, she answered with a calm only years of courtroom poise could produce. Forgiveness is not the issue. Accountability is. And once that is met, grace can enter. It wasn't a headline-friendly quote, but it was the kind that stays with you. The mural at Gate C-17 still draws travelers. Sometimes they don't understand its origin. Sometimes they search her name on their phones, and the video still pops up: a black woman standing calmly while two officers surround her. No yelling, no protest, just the strength of stillness. And for many, that's what courage looks like: not rage, but refusal to be erased. When the National Airport Authority asked if she would like her name engraved beneath the mural, Marcia declined. "Put something else," she said. "Something they'll remember, even when they forget mine." And so the words now read, "This space honors the unseen, the unheard, and those who remind us that silence, too, has a sound." In her last official address before retirement, Marcia stood not behind a bench, but beneath a stained glass dome at a community legal clinic named in her honor. Her voice, as always, was even, but this time it held something softer release. "They didn't ask who I was," she said. And maybe that was their mistake. But it was also a gift, because now we've made space for the names they forget to ask, the passengers stopped without reason, the students dismissed for how they speak, the elders treated like threats instead of wisdom. This work isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering them. There was no standing ovation, just a room full of people standing a little taller. More than her name, Marcia Ellison left behind a map, a way forward for those still walking, still waiting, still hoping. The next time they're asked for their name, it won't be the only thing that's seen. Marcia Ellison never intended to make headlines. She never sought to become a symbol, a movement, or the center of a national conversation. She was a judge, a woman of the law, who had spent her life believing in the power of structure, logic, fairness. But what happened to her on an ordinary morning at Denver International Airport shattered more than protocol. It shattered the illusion that title alone could protect someone from the deeply embedded biases still alive in the systems we trust to keep us safe. She stood in a boarding line, calm and composed, ready to board a flight, to continue the work she'd devoted decades to reforming the very justice system that would within minutes forget who she was. A single accusation laced with prejudice and passed through unquestioning hands was enough to reduce her from Chief Justice to suspicious passenger. She was cuffed without cause, detained without investigation, and watched by strangers whose silence echoed louder than any siren. But Marcia did not crumble. She did what she had always done. She observed, she remembered, and she responded not with rage, but with resolve. When the cuffs came off, her work began in earnest. She didn't just seek retribution. She built solutions. She launched the Flight Rights Project. She pushed for training transparency and truth in airport policing. She transformed her trauma into policy, her silence into advocacy, and her dignity into a beacon for others who had endured similar moments without the privilege of a name that carried weight. Through every speech, every reform, every quiet act of courage, Marcia reminded us that justice is not about who shouts the loudest. It's about who stands the longest. Her legacy was never about the moment she was detained. It was about what she did after, how she carried that pain, not like a wound, but like a torch, not to burn, but to illuminate. The lesson in Marcia's story is not just about racial profiling or misuse of authority. It's about the cost of assumption. It's about the danger of institutions that forget to ask the most basic question, who are you? And more importantly, why didn't we ask? In today's world, we are inundated with moments like these, viral videos, breaking headlines, stories that come and go. But Marcia's story asks us not just to watch, but to act, to look deeper, to speak up when something feels wrong, to create spaces where people are not judged by how they appear in line, but by the content of their presence and the dignity of their being. So what can you do? You can learn the laws that protect you and those around you. You can ask questions when others remain silent. You can refuse to let whispers dictate the truth. And above all, you can support stories like Marcia's not just to be inspired, but to be changed. If this story moved, made you pause, made you think, or reminded you of someone who has ever been overlooked, mislabeled, or silenced, we ask you to do one simple thing. Subscribe to this channel. By subscribing, you help us keep telling stories that matter. Stories that reach into the forgotten corners. Stories that challenge power, elevate dignity, and make you feel seen. Click the subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Share this video with someone who still believes justice shouldn't have to be earned through suffering. Because here we don't just tell stories, we witness them, and we walk forward together.